Good afternoon. I'm Dr. Chima Michael Danes. I'm a postdoctoral fellow here at the DEI. I'm just going to sort of provide some practical housekeeping tips before turning this over to Associate Professor Rozemarijn Roland Holst and her panelists for what will hopefully be a wonderfully stimulating discussion about small island states and climate change. Yes, so there's really only two things to say. There will hopefully be 15 minutes for questions at the end. Feel free to put your questions in the chat box prior to the end. Alternatively, if you wish, you can turn your cameras on at the end and ask your questions with the video, providing that sort of personal element, which would be really nice. Other than that, though, please, so as to save bandwidth, because there are so many of us, just keep your cameras turned off and your systems muted. And on that note, I turn things over to Professor Rozemarijn and Roland Holst. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Chima. And a very warm welcome to colleagues, friends, and guests joining us from all over, I imagine, to this DEI seminar on the role of small island states in driving climate action beyond the climate change regime. A very current topic in this year where 3 international courts are considering requests for advisory opinions on climate change. And just last month, the ITLOS, the International Tribunal for the Law of the Sea, was the first to issue its advisory opinion. We'll be taking stock of that. We'll be looking forward as well. And you'll be pleased to hear I won't be doing that alone, but with a wonderful panel of speakers that I will introduce to you. We have Professor Payam Akhavan, Professor of International Law at Massey College, the University of Toronto, and lead counsel for COSIS as well. That's the Commission of Small Island States on Climate Change and International Law. We have Zachary Phillips here, senior as a Crown Counsel at the Attorney General Chambers of Antigua and Barbuda. And we have our scientific dream team of Dr. Sarah Cooley, Senior Director of Climate Science at Ocean Conservancy, and Dr. Shobha Maharaj, Chief Scientific Advisor at the Institute for Small Islands. Both are also IPCC lead authors, and not only do they advise COSIS on key aspects of climate science and the ocean climate nexus, they've also provided this evidence in court. Our 5th listed speaker, Catherine Amirfar, was called away on an urgent matter and sends her apologies, unfortunately. Now, the plan for today is a little bit different from previous DEI seminars in the sense that I and the speakers are not going to be giving any lengthy presentations. Instead, the idea is that we will have a conversation where you'll get reflections from the speakers on these developments as well as learn from their experience. And before we get properly stuck in, I might just give a few short words on context. So as I mentioned, this year, 3 international courts are looking at requests for advisory opinions on climate change. That's the ITLOS, the International Tribunal for the Law of the Sea, which we'll be talking about, as well as the International Court of Justice, the ICJ, and the Inter-American Court of Human Rights. And you may have seen in the news lots of developments around climate litigation at the domestic level, but these are developments at the international level. And they are advisory proceedings. So they're a bit different from a contentious case in the sense that these courts are not asked to settle a dispute between states, but they are asked for authoritative guidance, interpretations on questions of law. And in all these instances, these questions relate to how the law applies to the impacts of climate change in various ways. The outcome of these proceedings, the advisory opinion, is not formally legally binding, but of course, very authoritative. And last month, on the 21st of May, the ITLOS was the first in this row to deliver its opinion. And that opinion was requested by the Commission of Small Island States, COSIS. Now, I think to appreciate the significance of this ITLOS advisory opinion, it's good to know a little bit about how we got there. So, Payam, can I ask you to start us off by telling a bit about the history of COSIS and the journey towards the ITLOS opinion?
Thank you, Rozemarijn, to you and Durham University for hosting this event, and thank you for all of your own contributions to learning in this field and to the pleadings that we made before ITLOS. In summary, COSIS was the result of the frustration, if not the desperation, of small island states at the failure of the COP process to effectively and genuinely address the issue of mitigation of greenhouse gas emissions, in addition to the question of loss and damages. It was frustration with the scheme of the Paris Agreement and the failure of nationally determined contributions to stay even remotely within the 1.5 degrees Celsius target that resulted in this shift towards international law. And it was remarkable for some of the heads of state and government of small island states to realize that much of what they've been asking for desperately over the past 30 years is for the main part already part of binding international law. It was with that understanding that on the eve of COP26 at Glasgow, the prime ministers of Antigua and Barbuda in the Caribbean and Tuvalu in the Pacific concluded the agreement for the establishment of COSIS, which was then opened to all members of the Alliance of Small Island States. Its mandate broadly was to contribute to the progressive development of international law in respect of climate change, but one of its specific projects and its first significant step forward was to request an advisory opinion from ITLOS. And I should add that coinciding with the establishment of COSIS, Vanuatu embarked on its historical initiative before the UN General Assembly to secure a vote requesting an advisory opinion on climate change from the ICJ. And of course, as the COSIS agreement became publicized in the months that followed COP26, more and more small island states joined, including notably Vanuatu. And by the time that COSIS appeared before ITLOS, there were 9 members, 5 from the Caribbean and 4 from the Pacific, representing about a quarter of all small island states. The COSIS the procedure that COSIS invoked to appear before ITLOS, of course, is significantly different from that of the ICJ insofar as an international agreement can trigger the advisory opinion jurisdiction of ITLOS. And in that respect, COSIS did not need to engage in the same level of lobbying or negotiating over the scope of the question or what have you. In terms of the substance of the written statement that COSIS submitted, together with 40 other states and international organizations, widespread participation, which shows that states, including those who are not climate vulnerable states or like-minded, are taking seriously the precedent-setting effect of these initiatives. The power of COSIS case was its simplicity. In summary, the first proposition was that greenhouse gas emissions constitute pollution under Article 114 of UNCLOS, and therefore that, secondly, they trigger all the obligations under Part 12 of UNCLOS to protect and preserve the marine environment. And the case was significantly assisted by the fact that those provisions are detailed in Part 12, and one can simply apply them to the question of climate change. But that brings us to the third point, which was the most crucial point in my view, which is that the obligations of states under UNCLOS, or for that matter under general international law, are not limited or defined by the Paris Agreement. The Paris Agreement can inform those obligations, but the obligations are do what is necessary to prevent significant, let alone catastrophic harm. And of course, the fourth point was that those obligations must be informed by the best available science, and that best available science is that temperature rise must be kept to within 1.5 degrees Celsius above pre-industrial levels. And that is where our two-star scientists, Dr. Sarah Cooley and Dr. Shobha Maharaj, appeared before the court and testified with great effect. The results really were quite remarkable. Exactly 1 month ago, minus 1 day, May 21st, we sat in the courtroom in Hamburg wondering what the opinion of the tribunal would be. And it was quite remarkable that the 21 judges from across the world came to a unanimous opinion, which essentially affirmed the 4 points that I outlined now. And COSIS walked away from this with everything that it had wanted and more. Now, one of the questions is, what will the effect of this precedent now be on the ICJ and Inter-American Court proceedings? And I would add that COSIS participated in the Inter-American Court hearings and is also participating in the ICJ hearings. So this is an interesting moment for the unification or harmonization of international law. And beyond that, another question is, what impact will this advisory opinion have in future COP negotiations or otherwise in influencing or rather pressuring the major polluters to change course? I will end simply by saying that the naysayers and those that believed that COSIS would be a disaster were many. There were many who said that this was a ridiculous idea that would never succeed. And it is a remarkable David and Goliath moment in the history of international law, when the smallest of nations, including Tuvalu, population 11,000, that had the privilege of visiting recently, as well as Antigua and Barbuda and some of the other members of COSIS, that they have risen up to exercise planetary politics, really, and to put this issue on the agenda of the so-called rule-oriented international order, and to hold the major polluters to their existing binding obligations, having been frustrated by 30 years of vague and empty promises that have now set us on the course of achieving almost 3 degrees Celsius temperature rise rather than a 1.5 degree temperature rise. So I will stop there and thank you once again for this invitation. It's wonderful to also be together with colleagues who were part of the Hamburg journey once more.
Thanks so much, Payam. I think that was an excellent impression. And indeed, I think one of the key takeaway messages from the ITLOS looking forward to the ICJ proceedings as well is this relationship between the Paris regime and other branches of international law. And the tribunal was very clear that they inform each other, but that they generate separate obligations. So that some of the arguments that were put forward, that basically everything states need to do is set out under the Paris Agreement, and that would, for example, also set aside obligations under UNCLOS. The tribunal was very clear in dismissing that line of reasoning and saying that no, there's a synergy, but they are separate obligations. And similarly, on the broader obligation under UNCLOS to protect and preserve the marine environment, the tribunal stressed that that had dual significance. That was the term they used. So yes, it requires mitigation measures, but also action targeted towards preserving and building resilience of the marine environment to the impacts of climate change, as well as adaptation, and that may involve proactive restoration measures as well of degraded marine ecosystems. And those obligations are obligations of due diligence, which is a tricky legal concept, but it basically means that states need to make best efforts to take measures, but that those measures are informed by a range of factors. And a very key one in there, apart from the fact that the tribunal stressed that the level of due diligence required, the standard required is high. A key factor in informing what measures should be taken is that science, that climate science. So I wonder if I may hand over to Sarah and ask your perspective on what the role of science was in these legal proceedings.
Sure. Thank you, Rozemarijn, for having me. And it is wonderful to be in community again with everyone that worked together on this. This is the first time that I've ever participated in a legal proceeding using science. So this was a new experience for me. And, so I watched every piece with great interest. And I was really intrigued to see that when we were in Hamburg, when the case was presented, most submissions did not contest the idea that heat and carbon dioxide constituted pollutants to the marine environment. I was guessing that was going to be more of a fight, and it wasn't. So that was fascinating. As an IPCC author, I feel that the science is settled and we do know enough to act. And the evidence does show that heat and carbon dioxide do have harmful effects on marine ecosystems. What's more, as I was looking through the literature on another project just a few days ago, I found we've known with pretty good certainty for 25 years just how the ocean takes up carbon dioxide. Since then, we've been getting more and more exact in our estimates, but we've known this for decades. So that was, it just kind of, it's this resonant effect of like, I'm so glad that that piece of information was not, subject to arguments. But because I'm an American, I've seen all sorts of climate science denial arguments. And so I felt like we were in for anything, but it was refreshing that this particular concept is not in question. So, so that was sort of amazement one. And, amazing thing too, to me, is that when we were going through the IPCC process, we were constantly reminding ourselves and reminding each other that the reports needed to be policy relevant, but not policy prescriptive. And so the idea was to compile and assess the best available information and present it in a way that was useful to others. And what was new in this last assessment report cycle is that the IPCC authors made great efforts to include Indigenous and local knowledge in ways that have not happened before, in recognition of the fact that there are a lot of ways of understanding this earth that we're on. And, dominant science is not necessarily the only way, but every knowledge tradition shows that things are changing, and it's because of people. So the IPCC conclusions that, heat and carbon dioxide are in fact harmful did not get contested. Totally shocking to me and totally wonderful. So to me, the decision, when it came down, it really solidifies the existence of this body of knowledge as the legitimate, best available information we have about how the Earth is changing. The fact that heat and carbon dioxide are in fact considered, meet the legal definition of pollutants because they have these deleterious effects on the environment. I think those were really important advances to unite these two ways of thinking about the world, the dominant science way, and then the legal and policy way. And I think that what's fascinating to me here is how the science has been almost, the scientists have acted in almost like a detective role, where we've collected all of these bits of information and we transfer it to people in hopes that justice will be done. And so that's the same thing as being, policy relevant or policy supportive, but not policy prescriptive. And I'm so excited that my role and the role of hundreds of other scientists could actually provide the information that enabled the court to kind of make these fine decisions and distinctions about exactly what the legal definition therefore meant. So that leaves all of these other questions to be decided that focus on jurisdiction and, you know, what the appropriate social system response, and those are squarely in the policy realm. So that's how I see, you know, sort of science feeding into this. It really was able to make the case that, you know, this is a comprehensive change. All nations are experiencing it. Some are experiencing more harm than others. And, you know, that really gets into the question of who's responsible then. And that's more of this policy question. So that's kind of how I've been thinking about this whole experience. And I cannot underscore enough how much I have learned through this process.
I echo that as well from the lawyer side. And I think there's really valuable experience gained in this case that was so firmly rooted in the science that will hopefully come in valuable ways in the future as well. Now, often in the advisory opinion, there is reference to this best available science, for which we often refer to the IPCC reports. And this best available science is what's supposed to inform the concrete measures that states are now hopefully going to adopt. Looking forward and how we are going to put this into practice, hopefully. Shobha, can you share some thoughts on what challenges and opportunities you see there?
Yeah, sure. First of all, thanks so much, Rozemarijn, for this opportunity to share a bit more. And it's so great to be here together with Payam and Sarah once more. So yes, I think as we all know, the opinion basically, you know, highlighted that science was at the heart of this request, and it did recognize the IPCC as an authoritative source of scientific knowledge on climate change. In fact, I think the opinion must have mentioned the IPCC over like 50 times or so within the entire text. But especially if you're looking at it in terms of the small island perspective, and I would, based on experience, I would say a lot of other like developing countries, one of the biggest bottlenecks towards perhaps putting this opinion towards any sort of effective use from my perspective as a scientist is that there is a chronic lack of data in terms of the impacts of climate change on small islands, on or around small islands and other developing countries. And this has a lot to do with the fact that there has been limited resources. Usually means that money for research tends to get pushed downwards. And especially if you think about, like, let's just use the Caribbean as an example. Whatever money that, say, would have been allocated for research tends to be siphoned back into resilience and recovery from, you know, almost annual, you know, bouts of hurricanes, and, you know, into the region. So instead of these nations, using money towards adaptation, of which I would assume research is part of, they are having to siphon money that they would have allocated to climate adaptation and resilience into recovery and building back. So if we don't have, and also this trickles down into the IPCC reports. If you don't have enough data, you don't have enough money going into research, then you don't have enough data. Then that means you have very little, and too little, in fact, publications from these data on the impacts of climate change for small islands and other developing countries. As a result, what happens is that the way that the IPCC works is that it is an assessment of the best available science. So if there are no publications coming out on the impacts of climate change, or very little coming out on the impacts of climate change for small islands, for example, that means that they can't be incorporated into the report. And that has given the impression on multiple occasions that, first of all, it dilutes the impacts that small islands are suffering within the report, as well as the fact it does give the impression that it's not so bad, which those of us on the ground who are actually seeing and working with these impacts know to be otherwise. So this is, and I think also this data paucity issue was brought up during my testimony for the ITLOS, and I was really happy to see that, like part of the opinion did sort of address this by saying that states have a number of obligations related to marine scientific research regarding climate change consistent with the IPCC mandate, including to observe, measure, evaluate, and analyze the risks or effects of pollution of the marine environment from anthropogenic greenhouse gas emissions, and to publish the results and to support developing states with these activities through financial and technical assistance, which there is a great need for. So I'm really curious to see how this is going to play out, because as we do stand at the moment, there is a major bottleneck in the sense that the publications, the research is not enough to basically clearly illustrate a lot of the impacts that are being that are increasingly happening. And I will hand it over back to you, Rozemarijn.
Thanks, Shobha. I think that's a really good point, and also an important role to play there for the science community, for research funders as well. And we might come back to that in a moment. Now, we've already touched a little bit on the relationship between the ITLOS opinion, which we now have, and the ongoing proceedings before the ICJ in the Inter-American Court. Now, we have Zach here, who wears quite a few hats, representing both Antigua and Barbuda and COSIS, of which Antigua and Barbuda is a founding member, across these three proceedings. So I was wondering if you can speak a little bit more to the relationship between these three proceedings and the relevance for small island states in particular.
All right. Thank you very much for the invitation, and great to see the COSIS team here. With that little introduction, I'll just expand a bit further so that the audience is aware of what context I'll be speaking from. So in my capacity as Crown Counsel, I represent the governments of Antigua and Barbuda as their legal attorney. And in that capacity, my role involves representations, whether it be drafting advocacy with COSIS, as we are a member, as well as negotiations within the UNFCCC process and at the UN General Assembly for a short time period in my career. So with that being said, the question of the relationship, I always love to use this example in that when we are taught international law, we have public international law at 9 a.m. on a Monday morning. And then afterwards, we run to Law of the Sea for 11 o'clock seminar. And then 3 o'clock in the afternoon, we discuss climate in international environmental law. Now, in real life, when we're dealing with states' obligations and how states have to respond or react to different issues, it's not, as separated or as siloed as we would have learned in university. And the unfortunate effect is that for reasons of efficiency, we also practice at the state level in this siloed experience as well, because we have the climate change negotiations that happen at a certain time of year. We have a certain space for ocean negotiations. We have a certain space for human rights discussions. And for most persons, most governments, most, entities, there are different people who discuss different things and may not necessarily know the overlap. Now, my perspective as a small island developing states, civil servants, in our countries, we do not have the large machinery that is the bureaucracy of the government. My example that I always give is in the AG's department, we have 3 attorneys who deal with all international law. So every treaty that Antigua and Barbuda has signed, there are only 3 desks that it will go to for review, whether for updates, whether for follow-up, anything along the lines. So for us, a lot of small island developing states, we really see how easily there is an interplay, there is an overlap, there is a connection between our obligations under the UN, the UNCLOS, and our obligations under UNFCCC, and whether it be the IP, whether it be the it's early in the morning here, forgive me, whether it be the International Convention on Civil and Political Rights or Economic and Social Rights, etc., we see the overlap. So I'll also add some specific context as well, because people understand hurricanes in a vacuum or extreme weather events in a vacuum. Adverse effects of climate change, you read it in a book, but unless you experience it, it's not, fully grasped. So Antigua and Barbuda falls square within the hurricane belt. Every year we get storms. Since I have been born and I am now 30 years old, I have experienced a storm of some sort every year. The issue is that as a result of anthropogenic emissions, the storms are getting worse. But not only are the storms getting worse, the storms are becoming more frequent, the storms are becoming larger, and the runoff effects are also more pervasive. We have floods that have flooded at different times of the year with less rain needed because the groundwater has already gotten higher because sea level is rising as well. So there are multiple interplaying effects that we are dealing with in our everyday experience. Now, I just mentioned storms. Most people would say that falls under climate change. I've also mentioned flooding and sea level rise. Those are issues that could relate to ocean governance, UNCLOS. I've also mentioned the need that floodings happen and people's houses are being displaced, and we now have to deal with recovery, human rights issues. So one event can touch on multiple areas of international law. And one devastating event that happens in the blink of an eye, I also would mind you, hurricanes are not long lasting. Literally, you go to bed one night and you wake up the next morning and everything is gone. And I'm not exaggerating. Barbuda was hit with a hurricane in 2017, and 95% of infrastructure on the island was gone. Not damaged, gone. So this is not an exaggeration with what our reality is. And then when you look at the effects that we are experiencing as a result of adverse effects, then let's also discuss the recovery efforts. Because if, let's say, the climate change regime was enough to deal with recovery, then Antigua and Barbuda, for example, would not have to go to the World Bank after Hurricane Irma hit in 2017, seeking funds to assist with recovery and be told by the World Bank that it will be on a loan basis. Can you imagine? Waking up, 95% of an island's infrastructure is gone, and then the response is, well, we can give you a loan so that you will repay it. Knowing full well that we lie within the hurricane belt, so there's a high possibility that before the loan period is over, there will be another hurricane. But unfortunately, this is a reality that we deal with. And again, those are issues of climate finance, debt sustainability, which are also international issues or issues between states. So I say all of that to point out that the reason that advisory opinions are so important and are so crucial to small island developing states is because how interconnected international law is. And in one of the former speakers mentioned that there's a frustration that exists with the UNFCCC negotiations. And I would agree that there is in fact a frustration, but I wouldn't go as far as to say or to suggest that advisory opinions or litigation on a whole is a way to replace the work of the UNFCCC structure. But from our perspective as small island developing states, it is literally, we need to use every tool in the toolbox in order to guarantee our sustainable future. Because as it is right now, again, not an exaggeration, there are islands that are sinking below the sea level. There are islands in the Pacific where the entire population are being relocated to other states, not other islands, because those other islands within the same state are also sinking. So it is at a point for small island states that we need to use everything in our toolkit to secure what we can, to engage in a way that we can. And advisory opinions are important because an advisory opinion represents the definitive expression of what the law is at that point in time. Now, why that is important is because negotiations are framed from a perspective of states working together to cooperate and assist towards a certain result. Negotiations are framed in a context of assistance, of political help, political support. I believe support might be a better word than help. So in that context, it also stymies progress within the negotiation space when it is that the political context or the political support is not behind certain issues. Whereas advisory opinions, being the reflection of the state of the law, don't need that necessary political buy-in in order for certain interests or rights to be protected and identified, which is why, in our opinion, one of the most useful results from an advisory opinion, despite it not being binding on individual states, is the ability that it will be persuasive in literally every other room in the world, because it is an authoritative description of what the state of the law is by the highest authority. So, with ITLOS being the highest authority on the law of the sea, an advisory opinion from them would be the authority on what the law of the sea interplayed with or connected with climate change issues and human rights issues, what that looks like. Similarly, an advisory opinion from the Inter-American Court on Human Rights, despite being a regional court for the Inter-American community, would still be an authoritative opinion on what the state of the law is as it relates to human rights and climate change. And all of those advisory opinions feed into the ICJ, which is the creme de la creme, because the ICJ has a much wider scope and literally has the ability to look at all areas of international law when answering the question, what are the obligations of states as it relates to the climate crisis? So again, just synopsis, it's not a situation of negotiations or litigation. It really is a situation of negotiations coupled with litigation. And in that sense, for small island developing states, we are at a critical juncture where if we don't try all the tools that are available to us, there may be a few less states in the UN in a few years. And the IPCC has confirmed that. So I think I'll stop here and allow for further discussion.
Thanks so much, Zachary, for these very insightful and powerful remarks. It's hard to follow this with anything, really. But we've obviously been talking about states and the need for states to systemically start taking this forward in a more systemic manner. And this is obvious, you know, it's an interstate system of international law. It's interstate dispute settlement mechanisms, and the advisory opinion similarly are proceedings in which states participate. But I think what's also remarkable in these proceedings is that we've seen a lot of support and a lot of drive from the grassroots out. So whether that's civil society, youth organizations, a really remarkable work being done in pushing this agenda. And I was wondering if, Payam, could you add maybe a few brief reflections on the role of this broad representation and also taking this agenda further forward?
Well, as I explained, when at COP26, the prime ministers of Antigua and Barbuda, Tuvalu concluded this agreement, it was very difficult to anticipate what the future would hold in terms of engagement and participation in this process. And I should add that there was a reason perhaps why the conclusion of the agreement was kept confidential. In fact, it was signed on October 31st in Edinburgh, and it was announced at COP26 at a press conference the following day on November 1st, in part because of the concern that powerful actors would sabotage the agreement before it could be concluded. So I can tell you now, I did not anticipate that we would get 9 members within less than 2 years. And it was thanks to the role of the governments of Antigua and Barbuda, Tuvalu, Vanuatu, joining at a very crucial time, that there was this buy-in. And I can say that there are more states that are interested but maybe hesitating because there are powerful actors, once again, whose view is that this is not useful. Let's just go back to the COP process and negotiate. As Zachary has said, nobody believes we can litigate climate change out of existence. Everyone knows that we ultimately have to go back to the negotiating table, but we need to change the framing of those negotiations. And in terms of participation, once again, I don't think any of us anticipated that 30 unclosed states parties plus 10 international organizations, including the African Union, the European Union, UNEP, and in the context of the ICJ proceedings, 91 states, UN member states and international organizations would participate, in addition to a number of civil society organizations who, unfortunately, unlike the Inter-American Court of Human Rights process, which is much more inclusive, can directly participate. They cannot do so in respect of ITLOS and the ICJ, but ITLOS, in fact, published those amicus briefs on its website, while at the same time stating that under its rules, they could not be part of the official record. So I think that this illustrates that in addition to what we get excited about as lawyers, the jurisprudence, the nuts and bolts of climate change and international law, that there is also another function which these proceedings have served, which is that they become a lightning rod to mobilize like-minded states, international organizations, civil society. And one last point, the global media interest has been absolutely phenomenal. During the ITLOS hearings, we had a media agency that told us that I believe some more than 200 media agencies from across the world, every corner of the world, had covered the hearings, and that by their estimate, the audience was at least 100 million. All this to say that this is an idea whose time has come, and this widespread participation, I think, is testament to that.
Thanks so much, Payam. And maybe before we soon will open the floor for questions, I'm mindful that there might be colleagues here in the audience, scientists as well, who are hugely inspired and who maybe, like Sarah and Shobha, are looking for ways in which their scientific work, their voice, can meaningfully inform policy forming processes, campaigns, and so on. Do you have any tips or experiences that you could share for anyone who is burning and itching to help move this agenda forward, and how your experience has been in trying to do that?
Yeah, I do. I think one of the biggest skill sets that has helped me with this is having done lots and lots of science communication work. I have been involved for a large portion of my career in various sort of science translation and science communication efforts, where I've had the opportunity to get practice in boiling down what the technical information is to put it in accessible terms that anyone can understand. So that's been a really big piece of just helping kind of broker the technical information for different audiences. And then the thing that put me in the position to help out here is simply being involved with the IPCC. So volunteer for these additional efforts. It's a big lift, I'll be honest. It was 3 years of very difficult scientific work, pretty much during the center of the pandemic. So everyone had all kinds of, other life complications happening at the time. But being involved in these science synthesis efforts is a really great way to help broker that knowledge. So even people who feel like their strength is not directly scientific communication can be helping to kind of roll up all of the technical details. I think that's one of the biggest things that I've that has kind of put me in the place to help out here. And another piece that I'd like to share is that scientists have always been trained to be highly objective. We're supposed to be just the facts. Here's the cause, here's the effect, here's the hypothesis, here's the answer. But really acknowledging that we are all humans and no one can be purely objective. And so recognizing where you come from, what biases and priors are in your own head is really important to be able to understand how that affects the work you do. Because then that allows you to say, well, here's how I see the world, or here's how my knowledge tradition contributes to this, knowing that, this is one piece of many answers. And then, I think Shobha can probably speak more to this than I, but I think helping really fill in those knowledge gaps in places where we lack data. We lack data not because things are wonderful. We lack data simply because we lack data. And so looking for those opportunities to expand the frontiers of knowledge in those data poor situations is really important. I'll stop there, and Shobha, I bet you have lots to say. Oh, you're on mute.
Well, Sarah, I think you pretty much covered most of it. But yeah, like just to reiterate a few things that Sarah already said, definitely, you know, volunteering your time for reports such as like the IPCC or similar is really a big lift. It does increase your agency as a scientist to help in, you know, situations, or to basically, first of all, for people to find you to begin with, and then also to be able to advise in situations such as this one. I think also context is really important. So the reason that I was asked to contribute to this was because of my context as, say, a small island specialist in terms of ecosystems, for example. It's not always going to be that, but the fact is, and it kind of feeds into the whole IPCC thing again. If you experience increased agency in terms of getting your work out there, then there's a higher likelihood of you being able to have an opportunity to basically contribute in this way. But something else that I would really like to speak to, and this is directly, but also indirectly connected to the case, is that, and it's something that Sarah also touched on. There is, I think as scientists, we all know that, you know, we're supposed to be extremely objective and, you know, simply, I think almost robotic in many ways. The dogma kind of like dictates that you're supposed to simply, without any kind of emotion, you know, do the test, like create the results, analyze them, and simply, like, you know, write the report pretty much. And it sort of like expects us to be what I call robots in a, but the fact is we're human, right? And we're all in the same, forgive the expression, boiling pot together, pretty much. And so basically, I think one of the things that I have struggled with post ITLOS for other work is basically having the courage to express that vulnerability that you as a human being, but also a scientist, feel. And it doesn't necessarily mean that if you feel vulnerable as a scientist and you would like to speak up about, say, for example, in my case, data gaps, that this is somehow skewing your ability or taking away from your ability as a scientist to do the work that you are known to do, and you have the skill set for. And also, in terms of vulnerability, I mean, vulnerability, you know, as a society, not just in science, it's discouraged, and it's you know, we're all supposed to be strong, etc., and that kind of thing. But there is actually a building literature in terms of vulnerability. Vulnerability is the mother of invention. It is also the thing that fosters innovation. It helps us scientists to basically improve our technique, our methodologies, etc. So I think there may be some of us scientists who, you know, maybe it's something a bit controversial and you're thinking twice about, you know, lending your expertise or lending your voice to it. But if it does speak to you, my advice would be to not shy away and to not let perceived dogma you know, influence your ability to contribute to these very, very pressing needs. We are literally running out of time, and I think the time for that is gone now. We really need to buckle down, and it's all hands on deck. Rozemarijn.
Thanks so much, Shobha, for those really powerful last words. And I think the wonderful thing about that is that is a way in which we can all not only make, but be a change in our own personal, professional practice, and in how we collaborate, and in how we cooperate, and in how we make connections and communicate about our work. So very, very, very good point. I am mindful that time is running away, and I would love to hear from some of our audience as well. So if you have any questions, reflections, comments, please either type them in the chat or raise your virtual hands, and I'd be very happy to give you the floor. Please briefly introduce yourself. It's always lovely to hear who we're talking to, and keep interventions to the point so we can hear from as many of you as possible. I see a hand from Dan Campbell, please.
Hello. That's tremendous, fantastic stuff. Let me say I'm an anthropologist, and I've been working mostly in the mountains of the Himalayas with issues of climate change and vulnerable and marginalized communities, but more recently with small island developing states as well, through the Association of Commonwealth Universities Climate Resilience Network. So it's absolutely brilliant what you've been doing. I would really like to hear what Sarah could say more about the incorporation of indigenous and local knowledge, and how can recognition be achieved, because a lot of us anthropologists feel we have lots of knowledge, but it's often embodied knowledge, it's tacit knowledge, it's working with people who are animal herders, who are fishermen, and a lot of the stuff that the way they know about change in the environment is kind of sensed viscerally often, rather than being put in propositional knowledge. There you go. There's a chunk of knowledge to put in your data set. So do you have any suggestions for how to work in making it easier to explain these differences, but needs to connect with different kinds of knowledge?
Sure. Well, I think the brief answer is this is just the beginning. Another very glib answer that I want to just make sure to get out there is that there is a section in the 6th assessment report that talks about the inclusion of Indigenous knowledge. And we did have some real experts, Indigenous scientists themselves, and people expert in working with Indigenous knowledge, wrote a section to really explain how Indigenous knowledge is incorporated here. One of the biggest challenges I faced as a lead author of the Ocean chapter in Working Group 2 is the relative lack of literature, peer-reviewed literature, gray literature that contained Indigenous stories. And so I think there needs to be, some sort of documentation of this Indigenous knowledge and of this local knowledge so that it can be pulled into something like the IPCC. But there are ethical ways to do that. And I think, researchers who aren't anthropologists by training are just learning how to do equitable and just research that elicits Indigenous knowledge, but allows Indigenous experts to maintain control and sovereignty over that knowledge, so that it can be combined and considered in parallel with dominant science knowledge. And this is a journey that I'm just beginning as a scientist myself. So, my short answer is, please help continue documenting Indigenous knowledge if you are in a position to do so. In an equitable and just way. And please help continue to circulate that to sort of the wider research world so that it can be brought in to these large assessments. Shobha, you've got so much to say, I'm sure.
Yes, thanks, Sarah. I totally agree with the 2 points that Sarah made, but I would just like to add perhaps a third, which is, let me give you some context. Last week, I think I was at this wonderful conference of, based on the promise of international law in the face of ecological crises. And I learned so much as an IPCC scientist, especially on the third day, which is where they were talking about science, traditional science, as say IPCC science, sort of, and in the combined with storytelling, especially from an Indigenous knowledge, local knowledge perspective. And one of the things that came out really clear is that there are lots of groups currently working with Indigenous knowledge and local knowledge who are very, very skeptical and quite justifiably annoyed with, say, the scientific, the others, the more traditional science world. They feel as though their knowledge is, and quite rightly so, is valid and has been sort of like sidelined. I remember having to put up my hand and saying, hello, my name is Shobha. I'm an IPCC scientist. Please don't hate me. And it was really like, it was really, really interesting. And so the point that, and I do believe, based on, the AR6, the last IPCC report, there as Sarah said, there was this beginning, this you know, the beginning of this, what I truly believe will be an increased effort to sort of like integrate more to a larger degree this local and indigenous knowledge into the IPCC reports. And one of the things, I mean, some of the groups actually went as far as saying that they didn't think that the IPCC report and the science there was good enough to basically help us with respect to our adaptation to climate change. Because especially in the small islands case where the data is so diluted, there's simply not enough data, and therefore you find like a dilution or perhaps an even miscommunication of the severity of these impacts if you say were to consider the IPCC reports alone. And so the point I try to make at that meeting is that, look, we're in a situation right now in history where climate change has never happened, you know, this rapidly and to this great magnitude before. And so we need everything in our toolbox. There's traditional science, there's also local and indigenous knowledge that, and there must be some sort of like, not just the, as Sarah suggested, you know, trying to publish more, whether it is published or, you know, peer review or great literature, but also trying to bridge that gap and, you know, have one indigenous and scientific, you know, these two types of science be two parts of the same coin, rather than seen as, say, opposing ends. And I think it's really up to those of us who are involved in this field to sort of like start publishing with that in mind, trying to bridge that gap instead of it being seen as, you know, a competition or some sort of like sidelining happening.
Great, thanks very much for your answer. Terrific.
Excellent question and excellent answers. We have a couple of minutes left. Does anyone else want to come in with a question or comment? Chris, please.
Hi, good afternoon. I'm Chris. I'm actually based in Grenada. I'm part of the Grenada land actors in that country. What I was going to say was that Canary, Trinidad and Tobago based NGO, did an ecosystem assessment. It's a pilot project. They've just published their reports, and they, because of the NGOs and CSOs' insistence, they've actually published as part of that report a huge, well, a whole chapter on Indigenous and local knowledge, and included that in the whole document because, as everybody's been saying, you know, it's an absolutely important and crucial part of any kind of research. Thank you.
Thanks, and good to know that there's already best practices and experiences out there that we can all learn from. Unless there's any pressing other question, I think I will ask all of you to join me in please thanking our wonderful panel speakers for all the insights they have shared. The DEI for all the technical and practical assistance, and all of you for being here online. Some of you at really ungodly hours, I know, so I really appreciate you being here. I certainly learned a lot. I hope you did as well. And I hope to see you again in person or online at another occasion soon. Thanks, everyone.